Enhanced Pearson Talon. In a sea of poor job design and poor job changes since Dawntrill, with the changes to our life windows, the reduction of 3-to-1 Nostrons, which was one of the actually enjoyable parts of the new kit, right? Spamming out Nostrons. And the upcoming changes to Black Mage, possible upcoming changes to Dragoon yet again, who knows? Lots of bad stuff, but there's one change that I really enjoy, which is EPT, or Enhanced Pearson Talon. So today I want to talk about some appreciation for Enhanced Pearson Talon and how there are some cool interactions with the skill, and how many different ways you can use it to spice up and optimize your rotation. The new ultimate fight through actually has us using upwards of like 8 or 9 EPTs in a single run, all being optimal under their context at least, which is an insane glow up from the previous PT being almost an entirely useless skill outside of some very niche forced disengages. Old PT was only 150 potency, and then they buffed it to 200 potency with patch 7.1. But the much more important change is that they added Enhanced Pearson Talon, which is 350 potency after using Elusive Jump, which opens up a lot of new options for us, right? At face value, just using it as a disengage tool, it is much better. Considering that the average potency for our combo GCDs, if you disregard dot ticks and you disregard Wormwind Thrust, you just look at the 10 GCDs we press, their base potency, it averages out to 366. So the old Pearson Talon being 150 was only half, not even half, of the average GCD we press. And then when you consider the way our dot works, for example, the fact that like healers and like Bard, for example, if they have to add like a filler or something, then it doesn't make a difference. Well, they don't even have a filler, they're doing filler. But they can reapply their dot whenever they want to. It's a separate system from their other GCDs, right? For us, it's all tied together in our one like 10 GCD combo. So if we add a filler GCD, it means that we're gonna refresh our dot 1 GCD later because of it. So with CS already not having a duration as long as the time it takes us to apply it, we're just gonna lose 2.5 seconds of dot uptime every time we add a filler GCD. So we're already less than half the potency of a standard GCD. We're also losing out on dot uptime, and every single combo GCD is progressing towards our next Raiden Thrust, which gives us a stack of First Mind's Focus, which leads to a Wormwind Thrust. So basically every single actual combo GCD is making 10% progress towards a Wormwind Thrust, so the opportunity cost for pressing one of them is 44 potency, which is 10% of your Wormwind Thrust. All things considered, it basically made it so Pearson Talon's potency was so low, and its effect was so useless, like it didn't do anything, right, to like remedy these issues. So you basically wouldn't press Pearson Talon until you were sure, absolutely sure, that the entire GCD roll of your Pearson Talon would be done by the time you can actually press your next GCD. So if you have more than 2.5 seconds of GCD downtime, then it's completely free. You'll take the 150 potency, sure, because it's given to you. But that's the only situation where you use it. If the downtime was shorter than that, then PT just wasn't really worth using, because it has so many negative interactions with the rest of your kit. 350 potency from EPT is much better at this, right? It's actually worth pressing. It's still worse than full melee uptime. When you consider all the factors for your proper combo GCDs, it's still like 100 potency worse than just continuing your combo. But you're not punished as heavily for pressing it. It's like a lot more intuitive, right? Like you have this ranged GCD. It makes sense that you should use it when you're not able to continue your melee combo. And that was actually worthwhile to do so. So I think it makes a lot more sense, and it's more streamlined in line with like other jobs and stuff. But it's especially good when we look at its unintended usage, which is using EPT as just a standard GCD. Now, why would we do that? We've already mentioned that it's lower than the average expected damage from our combo GCDs. But EPT gives us access to something that Dragoon has not had in a very long time, at least. Not since maybe before like Stormblood. I wouldn't even know because I didn't play back then. But ever since I started playing Dragoon, it's never had this, and it's something that I've always wanted it to have, which is a form of GCD flexibility. a GCD that doesn't fit into your combo and isn't set at like a certain point, but you can use it to manipulate your combo alignment, right? The only way we could really do this before is by just adding an extra true thrust somewhere in our rotation, but true thrust was so bad in terms of potency that although there were cases for it and it was interesting when it was relevant, it was just too niche and it really didn't happen like often at all. And in situations where it did happen, it was usually really obvious that you were going to do it, because it's such like, it has to be such a massive potency gain to be worthwhile doing, that usually it's not very interesting when you end up doing it, because it's like, yeah, okay, you were really scuffed on your normal alignment in this situation. So when are you actually going to be using EPT that isn't just like the standard disengage? Well, I think it's most interesting to go back to the fruit then and just go in order through like the 9 EPT usages, or 8, I don't remember right now actually. But go through in order all the EPT usages and just explain why and what and how much potency you gain and everything. Because basically every scenario that you would use an EPT possibly in comes up during Fru specifically. So it's pretty perfect for that. So I'm just going to go through and explain all of those usages now. The first one is quite poetic and funny really, because it's both a usage that would exist even with 150 potency PT. It actually doesn't really care that much about the 200 potency increase, it just makes it so much better. And also funny because the first optimization video I made on my channel was the one about pre-pull ranged skills, which is how we're gonna apply EPT in this situation. So at the start of through, the boss is targetable for 34.9 seconds before going untargetable to do Utopian Sky. If you want way more details on this, I have like a separate opener video, so you can watch that one if you're interested in this specifically and want more information. But basically, the boss is targetable for 34.9 seconds. Our GCD is 2.5 seconds, so as we go up, you know, we have a GCD at 32.5 seconds, and then we would have a GCD rule at 35.0 seconds, right? Because it's 2.5 every time. The boss goes untargetable just before, which means that we barely lose out on that GCD rule. This is all assuming that our first GCD happens at 0.0 seconds, which is generally how things are going to work out when you're using a melee skill like True Thrust. If anything, oftentimes you're going to hit your melee skill slightly past 0.0 seconds, because you have to enter melee range in order to use it, and the moment that you enter melee range is when it becomes possible, in this case, right, like depending on the aggro range of the boss, it becomes possible for you to get aggroed. The same applies to like movement skills like Wind Glide. It's preferred to use Wind Glide because it minimizes this like time period where you can get aggroed before pressing your first GCD, but there's basically always going to be this period where you can get aggroed. So depending on how greedy, how much you care, you could either use your like Wind Glide a little bit early, which is generally what you should do in like PFs and stuff for like normal fights, because the odds are so small that you're gonna be pre-pulling, because the aggro ticks are like 1 second, right? The boss will check their aggro range every 1 second, and if you're within that range at that point in time, then they're gonna aggro you. If not, then nothing happens. And even if they do aggro you at this point, you're only pre-pulling by like 0.2 seconds before other people, so it's really not a big deal. You'd rather take that like little bit of GCD advantage most of the time. In this case though, it doesn't matter. Even if you pull like slightly sooner, your GCD at 35 seconds is a Drake's Bane, so if you press that at 34.8 because you managed to hit your GCD somehow like 0.2 seconds early, it's still not going to do anything. You don't get a resource for pressing it, and it's going to ghost extremely hard. Then what options are left for us? We can use Enhanced Pierce in Talon. Because it's a ranged skill, we can use it before the pull at minus 0.85 seconds, because that's the application time for Pierce in Talon. And that's also how long it's going to take for the boss to aggro us after using it, because the boss doesn't aggro when you use a skill, it aggroes when you do damage to it. And every single skill has a different application time, but for PT it's 0.85 seconds, which means you use it 0.85 seconds early, and then your final GCD is now going to be at 34.15 seconds. And what would normally be your last GCD already, which is Fang and Claw, has an application time of around like 0.62 seconds. So it gives you barely enough time to squeeze in that Fang and Claw, which doesn't give you an extra GCD like at the end, but it gives you an extra GCD at the start. It basically makes it so the EPT that you used is completely free, because even though it took you much longer to reach the Fang and Claw, you weren't going to press a GCD afterwards anyways, so you have the exact same amount of GCDs, you just get the EPT for free. That's case number 1. Moving on to case number 2, because it's also actually in the opener, so we're going to very quickly go into this one. And this is the most straightforward, easy, obvious EPT usage possible. It can both coincide with the previous one, but it's way more commonly going to be used without the previous one, which is replacing your final GCD in a downtime that is over 30 seconds. So when the boss casts Utopian Sky, you're going to not be able to hit the boss for over 30 seconds, which means that your combo is always going to drop. No matter like when you press your final GCD. Your combo is always going to be restarting, you're always going to go back to True Thrust when the boss comes back. So what this means is that if your final GCD is less than the potency of EPT, then it's a gain to use EPT instead, because there's no repercussions. So this applies to most of all Lance Barrage and your 4th hit. Technically, all the GCDs that are below 350 are Raiden Thrust, Spiral Blow, Lance Barrage, Wheel and Thrust, and Fang and Claw. But you're never gonna use Spiral Blow instead of Lance Barrage as your final GCD in this scenario, so that doesn't happen. And you realistically don't often use Wheel and Thrust, but Wheel and Thrust can occur. So your 4th hit, both options are definitely possible. And then Raiden Thrust, you don't want to do this, generally speaking, for Raiden Thrust in like this kind of scenario, because Raiden Thrust gives you a stack of First Mind's Focus, and pressing that single GCD is basically worth half of your Whirlwind Thrust. So adding on the like opportunity cost for half a Whirlwind Thrust is 220 potency, which means that pressing Raiden Thrust is actually 540 potency instead of being 320 potency. So you definitely don't want to replace that with Pierce and Talon unless you have an entire fight mapped out and you know that like overcapping your Whirlwind Thrust will be so favorable for you due to like cleave windows or buff windows, etc., that in the long run, in like a really scripted fight where the downtime is like consistent, it's like you know that it's going to be a potency gain. That can happen, but don't assume that it will. So generally speaking, what you're replacing is a Lance Barrage or a 4th hit, either Fang and Claw or Wheel and Thrust. So in our opener, no matter what option you're doing, whether you're starting with the early Pierce and Talon or you're just starting with True Thrust like normal, you're always going to end with your final GCD being Fang and Claw, right? So you just press EPT instead. By pressing EPT instead, you gain 10 potency. Well, you have like Power Surge and possibly different buffs too. In this case, you only have Power Surge, so that 10 potency becomes 11 potency gained. It's a lot more strict if you're starting with EPT, because as we said, when you're pulling with EPT, your final GCD is going to be 31.15 seconds or 34.15 seconds, which is barely enough time to squeeze in a Fang and Claw. Technically, with like the 34.8 second uptime duration, you don't have time to squeeze in a PT. So what you have to do in that scenario is instead of using EPT as your final GCD, you have to use it as your second to last GCD, because that's fine, right? It just makes it so your Heaven's Thrust now goes from being your second to last GCD to your last GCD, which has a slightly faster application time of, I believe, 0.7 seconds. And then that, along with like pulling the boss to increase the uptime duration to 34.9 seconds, you can barely work this out. Once again, if you want more info on this, go watch the opener video itself. Number 3. So not too much to say about this one because we're actually using PT for its intended usage, which is disengaging. The only disengage that is really like forced in the entire fight, well, I guess P3. Anyway, during Burn Strike in phase 1, we have to take a tower, and this tower is a decent step outside of melee range. The tower snapshot for this happens at 65.6 seconds or 65.7 seconds ish into this current uptime. So we would have a GCD roll if we kept rolling our GCD perfectly at 65.0 seconds. But we're gonna have to replace that one with EPT because we won't have enough tower to, or we won't have enough time to press this in melee range and then go to the tower afterwards. So we press EPT at 65.0 seconds. At least in the case of fire. For lightning, you can greet the GCD at 62.5, but it's very, very tight. It's generally going to be recommended, especially because the risk is very high, right? Like if you don't get this, you might cause a wipe, or at least you will definitely take a damage down, aka a death. So you're usually going to EPT the 62.5 second GCD instead. When you're doing so, because the amount of time that you have to sit on your GCD for afterwards is only like 0.7 seconds, and you don't have an EPT anymore, you only have a regular standard piercing Talon for 200 potency, at that point you're just going to go AFK, wait for the tower snapshot, and then gap close back and continue your GCD combo. Number 4, and gonna lead into number 5 of this one as well, eventually. So going into phase 2, the opener of this phase is gonna have quite a lot of EPT potential, because our GCD alignment at this point is dependent on our phase 1 kill time, since phase 1 is actually the only phase almost in this fight that has a kill time that is not just a certain threshold of a DPS check. So depending on which GCD you were on when you kill phase 1, it's going to change your phase 2 opener. And also at the end of your phase 2 opener, Diamond Dust will reset your combo because it's longer than 30 seconds of downtime, so you will start with True Thrust afterwards. This means that, very simple, once again, same as before, if you're going to end on a 340 potency GCD, so in this case that will only ever be Lance Barrage or Fang and Claw, you're going to change it to a Enhanced Piercing Talon for a very quick and easy potency gain. However, for this window, there's a lot more potential, and even potential for a second EPT technically. Very interesting one. So since it's so kill time dependent and dependent on like the buff window you're doing before, I'm just gonna give one very like specific scenario because I like this one. I like this example, so I want to talk about it. Which is, if you're doing this 60-second window where you hold your 60-second buffs in phase 1 to overlap with your 2 minutes, this is what you want to do if you are not skipping towers, which is the kill time that we're gonna have in this example. So you're doing this 60-second window in phase 1. It's gonna make it so that your Lance Charge and your Gears Goggle in your opener in phase 2 will come up after Ride and Thrust. This Ride and Thrust also happens to be the exact point where we would overcap our Wormwind Thrust, which means that by adding one Piercing Talon before this Ride and Thrust, it makes the difference of fitting that Wormwind into our buff window or not. Basically what that results in is that if we know ahead of time that our final GCD is going to be a 340 potency like a Lance Barrage, we know already that we're going to use an EPT, but by placing that EPT before the Ride and Thrust instead of at the very end of the window, we're changing it so that instead of inside of our buffs we have a Piercing Talon for 350 potency, we now move that Piercing Talon outside and push in the Ride and Thrust alongside a Wormwind Thrust, which combines for 760 potency. So we can then take those two values and multiply, well, their power surged value, because they're both going to have power surge regardless of their position, by 26.5, because 26.5% is the multiplicative value of Lance Charge and Gears Goggle, or Lance Charge and Life of the Dragon. So we can now see the effect that the buff has on the potency, right? So by placing the PT ahead of the buff window and making it so our much higher potency value stuff is inside of the buffs, we are gaining 119.5 potency compared to the alternative where we just use EPT as our final GCD. Now, since the potency gain here is so big, being like well over 100 potency, it made me very curious at the time that I found out to check something else, which is, let's say you're ending this uptime on a GCD like Heaven's Thrust or Drake's Bane that has 440 potency. Normally it wouldn't be a gain to use EPT here, because obviously you're replacing a 440 potency GCD with a 350 potency GCD. But in this case, the alignment is making it such a massive potency gain that it realistically might actually outweigh the raw potency of the skills you're using. And the buff value might actually make it still be a potency gain. So I checked, and here you can see the difference, which is that unfortunately, the increase in buff value that the 440 skill gives you, because normally, as I said just now, right, you're swapping a 350 potency Piercing Talon for the 760 potency Wormwind plus Raiden, which that increase in buff value is a large contribution to why you're gaining so much potency. But at this point, you have a 440 HT or Drakesbane in your buffs already, which makes it so the buff value doesn't go up as much, and it drops the potency just barely too low, making it around like a 5 to 6 potency loss instead of a potency gain. But this leads into another very interesting scenario, which is when you're doing this, you're losing 6 potency, sure, but now your final GCD has become Lance Barrage. If you could once again replace that Lance Barrage now, well, in this case with HT, right? If you could replace that Lance Barrage with another EPT, then it would be a potency gain, because then you're gaining once again the 10 potency difference in the raw skills themselves. And then when you add the buff values from the Power Surge, Lance Charge, Life of the Dragon, all of those, it makes it so it's actually a gain of 14 potency, which would make it considerably better. Well, considerably is a big word here, but it would make it a fair bit better than these just no EPT HT alternative. Unfortunately, although this is a very, very funny, in my opinion, and like cool scenario, this is actually limited by something that you don't see often, which is that you don't have enough EPT. Because EPT is given to you on a 15-second buff from using Elusive Jump, and Elusive Jump has a 30-second cooldown. Unfortunately, we have the situation where in Phase 1, for the Burn Strike the tower, setting up the EPT for that, leading into, like, on the specific kill times that we're looking at here, right? Leading into having an EPT to use before the Raiden thrust, and then having another Elusive Jump and an EPT to use at the end is unfortunately not possible. So even though it's a really cool scenario, and I am counting it, it's number 5, okay? You know, if someday we get a charge for Elusive Jump, or somehow we get access to more EPT, then you could do it. But as of right now, it doesn't seem like you can make this work. So now you finally get to take a break from all the EPTs, as we don't have any more of them for Phase 2. The next one's actually going to be in the Intermission, or the Crystal Ad phase, where if you have followed everything perfectly up until this point, you haven't dropped your combo at any point, like you've kept your combo through Light Rampant and such, you're going to start the Intermission on Drakesbane, and it will lead into, if you do not clip at all, you're going to finish on Raiden Thrust. And then if you didn't clip at all, you can actually follow your Raiden Thrust with another GCD that will definitely ghost. It only has, like, depends on how clean and FPS alignment and such, but you're only going to have about 0.2 seconds after this GCD. So even with skill speed food, it's going to ghost. This is, you're not getting anything out of this, right? But that's fine, because we just pressed Raiden Thrust before it. The next GCD would be Spiral Blow, but we don't want to press that anyways, because we're going to hold this combo until P3. So it's very significantly better for us to enter on Spiral Blow as our first GCD in P3 than to press it now. So generally speaking, you either just hold your Raiden Thrust a bit and press it late so you can hold the combo, or you just go to True Thrust. What you can do instead is that if you are aware of the fact that you came to this point without clipping your GCD. Now, why do I keep clarifying that you shouldn't clip your GCD, or well, that you don't clip your GCD? It's because you are killing the crystal in this phase, and either something awkward might have happened while you're like doing your movement and your jumps around the crystal, or especially common is that your crystal might have died at a very awkward time. So you were about to press your next GCD on it, but then a different ranged caster or healer or something pressed the GCD on it, they killed it, and now you have to gap close quickly to the Iceville in the middle and press your GCD on that, and you clip by too much to a point where you're not going to be able to ghost the extra GCD at the end anymore. Another thing that can also happen is that your battle litany comes up like during your GCD roll, in which case it's generally preferred to press battle litany on cooldown then instead of rolling your GCD, because this gain that we're going to talk about from the GCD is super small, so it's more important to just keep battle litany aligned. So in the event that it happens to be that you don't clip your GCD at all, what you can do is you can replace your Raiden Thrust with an EPT, so at first, and then after the EPT, you're still going to be able to ghost the right-in thrust, which means you can still hold your combo, you're still getting the first mind focus stack and everything, but you're just doing a better GCD now. It's very like simple, but it's, in my opinion, a really cool and like neat one. I don't know, I rate this one EPT out of EPT. It's a good one. So the potency gain for doing so, you're only getting, like you're getting 30 potency, right? You're going from a 320 potency skill that doesn't ghost to a 350 potency one. You have power surge though, so that's going to increase it by 10%, so it's 33 potency. But the Ice Veil has a 50% damage reduction buff, which means that you have to reduce the potency by 50%, which means you're gaining 16.5 potency basically. But it's still a very cool one in my opinion. And like it's a fun reactive one. It makes you actually pay attention because you have to remember whether you clipped your GCD or not. So EPT number 7 is definitely the most complicated one. It's going to introduce a new concept that we haven't discussed so far, but it also just interacts with so many different factors. So the goal for this EPT is that we enter P3 on Spiral Blow, and during phase 3, if we swap our food before the stun on Ultimate Relativity, I have posted a video about this previously where I showcase it. If we swap to a 2.49 GCD skill speed food, we can actually gain a GCD roll by the end of the phase. This is because we spend a fair bit of time with a slightly faster GCD, and it also lets us roll our GCD just before the knockback by Darkest Dance, I believe it's called. So like that gives us a significant amount of GCD time that we normally don't have, and this is going to add up to let us roll a whole extra GCD in phase 3. However, it doesn't give us all the time in the world to have it apply. If we simply do this without any EPTs, we're going to finish on Drakesbane, and because Drakesbane has a unholy application time of 1.65 seconds, it's still going to ghost. However, if we add one EPT, we will now have that EPT, but also be able to finish on Wheel and Thrust, which is not going to ghost because it has an application time of 0.66 seconds. So we basically end P3 the exact same way as we would without doing all of this extra stuff, which means that we just need to know, did we do more damage in P3 or not? Because that will determine if this was worth doing or not. So what is actually different? For the most part, we're basically getting a free enhanced Pierce and Talon, right? We're doing all the same GCDs, plus one enhanced Pierce and Talon, which is worth 380 potency with Power Surge. It also happens before the food swap, so we don't have to worry about that. And then, because it's happening before our 2-minute burst window, and before our final 60-second burst window, we have to consider our alignment in these. So for this video right now, for this example, I'm gonna stick to one specific Wormwind Thrust alignment, because you could enter P3 with 1 stack of Wormwind Thrust or with 2 stacks of Wormwind Thrust. I've done a lot of like looking into the 2-stack alignment, and although I am quite confident that this is still a gain on the 1 Wormwind Thrust alignment because it's such a big gain on the 2, but I'm not entirely sure about the numbers of how much of a gain it is and the sequencing that you would do. I think it's pretty straightforward, but I'm not like 100% sure right now, so I'm gonna cover in this video the same as what's in my video, which is the 2 Whirlwind Thrust alignment. So on that alignment, it's a really big deal because you are significantly improving your 2-minute burst window. Because although you are taking Gearskogel outside of Litany, which is a small loss, obviously very small, right? Because Gearskogel was only like 380 or like 330 potency or something with Lance Charge, and Battle Litany is only around a 5% damage buff as like a expected damage multiplier. But outside of that, you are putting the Wormwind Thrust that you would normally have to spend before your 2-minute, you are putting it into both Lance Charge and Gearskogel, which is a really big damage gain, right? So your 2-minute is becoming better by around 100 potency. Your 60-second burst window later on doesn't change. You are, instead of buffing after a Drakesbane and finishing on a Heaven's Thrust, you are buffing before the Drakesbane. So you're swapping a 440 for a 440, it doesn't make any difference, it's all the same. it technically could make a difference depending on your like life surge alignment, because it might not be possible for you to life surge the second Drake's Bane in this window, in which case you would be forced to life surge the HT at the end, because you want to use 2 life surges in this window. In that case, that would be a slight loss. You would still do this, spoiler alert, but that is something to consider, and that's also a reason why you really want to have that LS up early, but that's not what this video is about. But that is something that you have to consider as a result of doing this. So generally speaking, the 60-second window is the exact same. And then obviously there's a very big loss, which is that you're using skill speed food for like the second half of this phase. So maybe soon I plan on making a video about skill speed, so I'll explain this more in depth. But you look at the difference in your damage multiplier with the gear that you have on your 2.5 set and then your 2.5 set with the skill speed food. And then it's going to be different how these things, because skill speed is a separate multiplier for your dot ticks and your auto attacks. Although for the most part, how skill speed interacts with your dot ticks and auto attacks is that you're always going to do the same damage as 2.5. This is not entirely true, and it's going to vary a little bit depending on your stats. But generally what you can expect is that as your GCD goes down and you lose substats, the skill speed will just make up for it in a way where your dot ticks and auto attacks will still do the exact same amount of potency, relatively. But for the rest of your GCDs, you are losing a slight bit of potency every time you use something because you have worse substats. For this fight specifically, or for this phase, by the amount of time that you spend with skill speed food, you are losing about 125 potency due to it. So that's a loss. And then at the end of the phase, you also lose a tiny bit of dot duration, because normally you would have a lot more leeway after your wheel and thrust ride, because you would almost be able to press the Drake's Bane. So usually your final CS, because you would want to finish this phase on CS. Normally it would have a 4.5 second duration, but when you're doing the food swap and the EPT and stuff, it's going to have 3 seconds of duration. So that's not a guaranteed tick difference, but depending on the dot tick timer, there's like a 50% chance that you lose a tick, so you're going to account for it as being 50% of a tick. What is 1 dot tick? It's 45 potency, which means that you're taking half of that 22.5, and then with the multipliers, it should only be power surge. So 22.5, I didn't map this out beforehand, plus, so 24.75. So overall, if you add together all the losses and all the potency gains, this ends up being a potency gain of 335 potency on this specific alignment, which is a really big potency gain. But this is also definitely not nearly as straightforward as all the other things like before this. This is much more in the territory of something you have to spreadsheet, and something that's a lot harder to find. How do you like find this stuff? So initially for me in Prague, I just looked at the fight, right? And you see that you are entering this burst window 1 GCD too late to get the Whirlwind Thrust. It's similar to the P2 opener thing, right? Where if you add 1 PT, you can fit this Whirlwind Thrust into your buff, which is generally, that's the biggest value you're going to get from changing your buff alignment, is when you're able to go from buffing after a Ride-in Thrust to before to get the extra Whirlwind Thrust, because you're still hitting very good GCDs. So in this case, I looked at it, I saw that you can do this, and then, you know, with skill speed food, you're getting the extra GCD. If anything, you have to do the EPT with skill speed food, because otherwise you're going to ghost that GCD. And then for phase 4, you're going to want to be like backwards on your alignment anyways. It's slightly better if you entered on Ride-in Thrust instead of Drake's Bane, but very, very slightly, and then you would end up EPTing anyways. TLDR, it's good, but it's definitely hard to find, and this is up there as like the higher skill ceiling on the spreadsheet theory crafting side. And then the final EPT of this video is going to be one that's on the opposite end. It's very reactive skill ceiling, where you just have to get good at it from performing it a lot over time. But yeah, that's all for this one then. Now we're definitely getting close towards the end. The 8th EPT, I'm going to be very quick with this one. It's pretty much the exact same as what you did in phase 2 in the example, where continuing with the same Whirlwind Thrust alignment that we had in the last example, you're in a 2-target scenario, and with the buff alignment that we want to have, you're normally going to end up buffing after Ride-in Thrust when you have just spent your Whirlwind Thrust, and then you're going to end this phase, this uptime, with a Fang and Claw. So logically, you're gonna EPT anyways. You might as well do it now. Get a massive 2-target Whirlwind Thrust under your buffs for really significant potency gain. On the other hand, if you had the different Whirlwind Thrust alignment in this situation, you wouldn't have the Whirlwind there. So instead of swapping the EPT for a Raiden Thrust alongside a Whirlwind, you would much rather have an EPT instead of just a Raiden Thrust, so you would keep the EPT towards the end. Well, this video definitely took a lot longer than I was expecting it to, but we're almost there. So for the very final EPT that you will generally expect to do in Fru, this one's at the very end of phase 5. No matter when the end is happening, no matter what your kill time is, it's always going to apply, which is that, as we've mentioned plenty of times in this video, you have a few GCDs that are weaker than EPT. So when you're killing a boss, this one applies to any fight in the game basically, except for like door bosses, which might die at a threshold. Although technically even then you could do it based on the threshold. So any boss in the game, this is going to apply to. Your final GCD, if it's weaker than EPT, you would want to replace it with EPT. For example, you're about to kill the boss is like 0.6% health or something, and you estimate that with like the speed that it's going down, you're getting like 1 more GCD, right? It's always a good habit to elusive jump. You should teach yourself that always when a fight is ending, when a fight reaches a certain like low HP threshold, where you're not expecting the 15 seconds for the EPT to run out, you get an EPT, just to be safe. And then let's say the boss is like 0.6% health, and you're about to get a Raiden Thrust. This Raiden Thrust is not going to give you access to Whirlwind Thrust. You have already used it, you have 0 stacks of First Mind Focus right now. Then basically, replacing the Raiden Thrust for EPT is just 30 potency better, right? However, there's a lot more complications with this still. For example, in the Raiden Thrust case, Raiden applies faster than EPT. So if you have the choice between Raiden and EPT and the boss is like 0.2% health right now, like you're about to press your GCD and it's 0.2, 0.1, it's really close to dying, you should just press Raiden Thrust. Because Raiden Thrust applies in 0.62, maybe 0.66 seconds. Whereas EPT takes like another 0.2 seconds on top of that. So worst case, that difference somehow ends up being the difference of you hitting before someone else or after someone else, and your entire EPT is going to ghost. More realistically, you're going to overkill anyways, right? Even your Raiden Thrust, you're not going to get the full 320 potency. It's just going to do like 200 potency worth of damage, and the rest is going to overkill. So what's the point of getting that extra 30 potency if it's going to be overkill or it's just going to ghost additionally or anything? If it really seems like it's going to die right now, you should just press Raiden Thrust. There's even an argument to do uncomboed CS, which I'm sure I'll make a video about someday, maybe. That's another interesting GCD concept that maybe should have been part of this video, because Chaotic Spring has our fastest application time. But I'm not going to go too deep into that. So if it's going to die very soon, you want to Raiden Thrust. However, if it's definitely not going to die soon, let's say you're going to press Raiden Thrust, but it has like 1.2%. Obviously, it depends on the boss HP. 1.2% could be like 4 more GCDs, or it could barely be 1 GCD, depending on how much HP the boss has. But let's say you're expecting like 1 solid GCD, and then maybe another one. If you press Raiden Thrust right now, you're going to get the Raiden Thrust potency, and then your next GCD is going to be Lance Barrage. If you press EPT right now, you're going to get that potency, and then your next GCD will be the Raiden Thrust that you just replaced. In every case, if you are sure this GCD that you're doing right now will not ghost, EPT will be better, because you're not caring about the application time of EPT versus Raiden Thrust, and the next GCD, Lance Barrage, is going to be weaker than EPT anyway. So even if you were to press Raiden Thrust and then do the Lance Barrage, you'd want to EPT anyways. But then there's one difference, is that instead of doing Raiden Thrust EPT, you would now be doing EPT Raiden Thrust, which once again applies faster than EPT. So as you can see, in this case, it's very safe, very good to always do EPT if you are pretty damn sure that this GCD is not going to ghost. And then there's 2 more cases for this raid, technically 3, which the DLC one would be Raiden Thrust when it's going to give you Whirlwind Thrust, because there's technically like a 1-second window, because the application for Whirlwind Thrust is so long, where EPT was better. if you ever do that on purpose and it works out for you, then honestly good for you, but I wouldn't go for it. That is like way too precise and there's too many factors and that's unlikely to work out for you. You should just Ride and Thrust in that case. But there's also Lance Barrage and there's also Fang and Claw. So for Lance Barrage has a slower application time than EPT. So if the boss is actually about to die, it's like 0.1%, you should EPT instead. If that's not the case, it gets really quirky, right? Because if you are going to apply this GCD, but you really don't think you're going to apply the next one, then EPT is still 10 potency better, but that's only 10 potency. And if the boss happens to live for longer than that, you get to Heaven's Thrust, or you could have chosen to do Spiral OCS, which is, you know, very quirky alternate option, but you get to Heaven's Thrust, and then Heaven's Thrust would have been so much more potency. You get the idea. Honestly, if you want to read more about this, the Advanced Dragoon Guide link below, I've written about this. You can go there. It has little graphs to show how efficient certain options are. But yeah, this is like a really, really high skill ceiling thin. It's too complicated, honestly. It just takes muscle memory. You just have to get used to it. The same goes for when you should use CS uncomboed. And that's everything. So as I said, this video got way longer than I expected. I was like contemplating on, do I make this an edited down video again? Because I've been doing that more recently and I do enjoy doing that. But I also kind of thought I want to do like a yapping video again. So it went that way, I guess. Like this video could have been 8 minutes and it could have been what it is now, which is like 30 something minutes. But yeah. So I hope you enjoyed watching this or listening to this. I hope. If you watched it, then I don't even know what you're watching. But yeah, that's EPT. If you have any questions at all, feel free to leave it down below or on Discord or on the Balance Discord. Anything works. And I'll see you in the next one.